let's talk about an exception. We're going to talk about what I call anomalies, exceptions to the general rule. Anthony Johnson arrived in Virginia in 1621. And you remember the first African slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619. So this was just right after, and there were very few Africans in Virginia still in 1621. He was referred to in the records as Antonio, a Negro. The records of early Virginia had been well kept, but not noticed for some time. And around, I think, 1990, some graduate students working on their thesis got into some of the records and began to study and to scan some of the early log books. And one of the people that they found of interest was Anthony Johnson. They found that the very next year, he survived the Good Friday Powhatan raid there on the plantation where he worked, where he had, we assume that he was an indentured servant. He was on a tobacco plantation. But remember, we've studied the Powhatan raids and the problems that took place between the Powhatans and the colonists after Pocahontas died. Then in that raid, 355 colonists were killed. And on the plantation where he lived, 52 were killed. Only 5 people survived. 5 people on the whole plantation of the workers and the owners and everything. And there was a record kept to that. So we know that he survived. Remember what I said about survival? He survived. Possibly he was heroic because we see that he'd only been there a year, right? Then we see that by 1625, he had complete freedom. He was free. He was not mentioned as an indentured servant or anything. And he had married an African woman who was called Mary, a Negro, and she had her freedom, and they had 4 children. They had property. They owned property, and they raised livestock, and they farmed their own place. We have records of that. We also have records of them testifying in court and having other rights, voting, having other rights that you don't think about blacks having, but they did because of the harsh conditions, because they survived, and because they had earned the respect of people around them, people that, and they helped one another in different on different occasions. Now we know that Anthony had property of 250 acres there in Virginia, and his sons acquired property adjacent. When they became adults, John and Richard were his sons. There are also records of them, and they seem to do, according to the people who studied these records, they seem to act as a family unit. They seem to do things as a family unit, as other families did. Other families were the same way, acted more like tribes or something, you know, where the father and the sons get together and make decisions. So he purchased at least one slave to work his property, possibly more, but there's record of his purchase of one, and there was a dispute about ownership of his slaves. Somebody else, a white property owner of ill repute, tried to steal his slave. He took them to court, and there are court records of that. And the court ruled on behalf of Anthony Johnson. So we know that he must have acquired a lot of respect from the town in general, from the townsfolk, for him to have, for one thing, have the knowledge and confidence to take someone to court and then to win in court. And he then, in 1665, he and his sons and his wife, his family, his extended family, moved to Maryland. If you remember from your textbook, you read that what began to happen to tobacco farmers in Virginia, their land began to wear out, right? So he, like many other people, moved to Maryland and leased land in Maryland, 300 acres. Instead of purchasing land, he leased it. He sold his 250-acre property in Virginia, and he took with them 14 head of cattle and 8 sheep. And here is a primary source. Here's a document from the archives. I can barely see it, but with a magnifying glass, you could verify that he did. Now, in 1670, he died, and then Mary, his wife, was able to extend the lease that they had on the property. She personally, in her name, was able to extend the lease for 99 years. But we don't know what happened after that. That's the last mention of Anthony or Mary Johnson or their sons. We don't know what happened. The only other mention of Anthony Johnson in any records was that a Virginia court ruled that property, and it was still referred to, it was still referenced as Anthony Johnson's former property. So again, in 1670, in a court ruling, his former property went back to the property of the Crown on another issue, but the property was still referenced as Anthony Johnson's property. And so, but that was the last historians have heard of him. And of course, everybody would like to know what happened. What happened to his children? What happened to his descendants? But as far as I know, that's still unknown. Here's the book that I read, Mine Own Ground, and it's about Anthony Johnson, and it references many different instances of mention of him in the court records, in the documents and property list, and we see that he owned weapons. We see that his wife was the slaves, women, servant women, white indentured servants, and servant women were considered in a different taxation category. Men and property had to be taxed if a servant woman was on their property, but there was special court records that Mary Johnson, wife of Anthony Johnson, was not in that category and would not be taxed accordingly. So we see, and this book just has all these different instances. I can't take the whole class to tell you everything, but it's incredible. And what we see is that apparently when he was purchased as an indentured servant, and then he was able, because of his accomplishments and his survival, to gain all the rights and privileges of other men. So this is an anomaly, an exception, but it's possible that there were other early African slaves who were able to do this, but we don't have the record of it. We do have the record of Anthony Johnson.